Hi friends, we are going to talking about hire purchase concept. Before going to journal entries in the books of the buyer, two rules are we must know. First one is vendor. Who is vendor? Vendor is the seller. Suppose for example, Mr. A purchased a van from a B. So Mr. B is the seller. Mr. A is the buyer. So, in the books of the buyer, vendor shows a credit balance. So, he is the creditor because in the case of due, first of all, the vendor is the creditor, and after the payment, vendor becomes receiver. Okay. In the due case, vendor is the creditor, and after the payment, vendor becomes receiver. The two rules must know before going to journal entries. So we are going to journal entries in the books of the buyer. 6 journal entries in the books of the buyer. Who is the buyer? Buyer who is purchased a asset from the vendor or the receiver or the seller. So first of all, we draw 4 columns, identify accounts, identify type, rule and the entry. The first entry is asset on credit. A buyer purchased an asset on credit. So, how many accounts here? Normally only 2 accounts in the journal entry. So, 2 accounts, which are they? First one is asset and the second one is vendor. So identified asset is a real account and vendor is the personal account. In the real account, asset is debit. Debit what comes in. Here in the case of due. In the due case, first of all the vendor is who? Vendor is the creditor. So credit the creditor. So the journal entries asset account debit to vendor account. Okay. And the second journal entry is down payment. Here already said that a buyer purchased a asset from a vendor. So if the vendor asked some amount from the buyer. So the first before the first installment, the buyer pays a some amount to the vendor. So such amount is called as down payment. The down payment, vendor and the cash. In the case of payment, vendor becomes who? Vendor becomes the receiver. Personal. Debit, the receiver. And the cash, real account. Credit, what goes out. So, vendor account debit to cash account. And the third entry is interest due at the year end. At the year end, interest due. So, 2 types of accounts here. First one is interest and the second one is vendor. Interest and second one is vendor. Here interest is a nominal account because it's a revenue expenditure. What is revenue expenditure? Revenue expenditure is used immediately or within 1 year. Okay. For example, rent is a revenue expenditure and interest. So interest is a nominal account. And in the case of vendor is a personal account. So interest, nominal account, vendor, personal account. So here nominal account is, here interest is a nominal account, it's a revenue expenditure. So it's an expense. So in the case of nominal account, debit all expenses. Okay. So debit all expenses. Vendor is a personal account. In the case of payment, vendor becomes who? Vendor becomes the receiver. Sorry. Here interest is due. In the case of due, vendor is who? Vendor becomes the creditor. In the case of payment only, vendor becomes the receiver, and in the case of due, vendor is the creditor. Here credit, the creditor. Okay, you must know about these two concepts. Okay, so interest account, debit to vendor. In the case of due, vendor is the creditor, and after the payment, vendor becomes the receiver. Next, fourth is installment paid. In the case of installment, the buyer pays the amount to the vendor. In the books of the buyer, two accounts in the case of installment, which are they? First one is vendor and the second one is the cash. Vendor and cash. We already know vendor is the personal account, cash is the real account. So in the case of payment, vendor becomes the receiver. So debit the receiver. Here the cash goes out from us. So credit what goes out. So vendor account, entry is vendor account, debit to cash account. Okay. The fifth entry is depreciation. We already know it decrease the value of it reduce the value of such asset. Okay, so it's a loss. So in the depreciation, two accounts, depreciation and the asset. So depreciation is a nominal account and asset is a real account. Here depreciation is a nominal account. So the rule is debit all expenses and losses. Here it's not a expense because it is not in the form of the cash. So depreciation is debit all losses. Expense alla. Okay. Asset what goes out. Credit what goes out. Here, due to depreciation, the value of the asset is reduced. That's the reason we credit the asset what goes out. So the journal entry is depreciation account, debit to asset. Okay. And the last entries, we already know here the two nominal accounts here. First one is the interest and the second one is the depreciation. So before going to the balance sheet, we transfer these nominal accounts to P&L account. So the entry is transfer of nominal accounts. Entry is P&L account, debit to interest to depreciation. Okay. These are the 6 entries in the books of the buyer in the case of the hire purchase. Okay. Thank you.